We have today a very interesting guest. He last was here, as a matter of fact, on September 11th, 2013. So it's been a year and a half or so, a couple of years. And he has administered the, anyway, he's been involved in this type of police law administration for a number of years. I'd like to put our hands together for Chief Clifford Cook, Bellingham Police Department.
Thank you, Riggs. I have a question for you, because I have a partial answer. I already know one member here that's going to respond yes to my question. How many of you are Rotarians? How many of you are Rotarians, belong to the downtown, is that correct, Gary? The downtown Rotary?
The main Bellingham.
The main club?
I think I'm the only one.
Bellingham, not Maine.
The Bellingham.
The main Bellingham club.
Just Bellingham.
Okay, Gary's the only one that's that apparently heard me speak on this topic, so I'll feel a little better about it. Last time I addressed this group, I'd just taken over the department. I'd been there about 7 or 8 months. Now been here a little over 2 years, and a lot has happened. A lot has happened on a national level that has an impact on policing across the country. And if you're paying attention to the headlines in various newspapers and media outlets across the country, what you're hearing is some very concerted criticism of law enforcement. I think some assumptions about what contributes to the recent increase in number of police shootings, particularly police shootings that involve members of the minority community. And in some cases, those individuals were not armed, as the media likes to say. And I don't want to get into those individual incidents because they all have distinct and unique aspects to each. What I can tell you, and I think the recent ruling by the U.S. Justice Department on Officer Wilson's actions is reflective of that, is that we have a propensity in this country, particularly from the media, to jump to conclusions, draw based solely on assumptions. And one of the concerns I have as a police chief is when one of my officers is involved in what we would refer to as a critical incident, which entails any number of things, but a critical incident that results in the death or serious injury of another individual, a citizen. And it's happened in Bellingham. 2013, we had 2 officer-involved shootings. One was a result of a robbery, if you'll recall, in a pursuit, and we had a shooting occur where the officers were fired upon and returned fire. And then subsequent to that, we had an individual who was suffering from mental illness at one of our local motels right here on Samish Way, who produced a shotgun and fired on the officers, and they returned fire. A lot of questions come out of those types of incidents, as you have heard, as I mentioned a moment ago, about what you're seeing happening across the country. So as a police chief, the concern is how do I convey to the community that I'm responsible for and who I have to answer to as a public official, that our officers or our department is doing things the right way. And that is, they're not utilizing deadly force unless they're not only legally authorized, but justified. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult bar to meet. It's a very high bar. Because quite frankly, many people don't understand the dynamics involved in a confrontation that is highly either physical or involves a serious degree of threat to the individual officer. So I asked this question at the last presentation. How many people in this room, and I'm going to suspect there's a few, how many of these people have been in a situation where they have been in a knockdown, drag out, physical altercation where your life may have very well been on the line? What was the context?
Police officer in LA.
Okay. Glad to hear that. Yeah. Someone who I think can relate a little bit, maybe more so than I realize.
The county executive is here and he has to deal with the council.
I think that's a mental exercise, isn't it, Jack? Yeah. So, unfortunately, it's hard for us to convey what happens in those kind of confrontations, and quite frankly, when you see something on video in particular, and you see that type of confrontation played out, it's not pretty. Anytime a police officer has to use force, it is an ugly thing to see, because for the majority of us, we don't see that very often. And because it's not a very pretty thing to see, it's in fact an emotionally upsetting thing to see, we tend to be very critical of what happens or may have resulted in that altercation occurring. And then how do we judge whether the officer did the right thing or not? So as a consequence of what's happened nationally on all the officer-involved shootings, what you're hearing more and more about is the idea that police officers should wear body-worn cameras to record their interactions as they go about their workday. And you're actually seeing some states that are introducing legislation that will require officers to wear body-worn cameras to document what they do. There was a bill introduced in Olympia that was asking for that very thing to happen. Now, there was no fiscal note attached to it, meaning there was no money. The cost of putting those cameras out was going to be borne by the individual departments. And I can tell you from experience, it's not a cheap endeavor to step off into. But that's the trend. That's where many people see the solution. And I'm here to tell you that is not a panacea for the problems we're looking at. I think there needs to be further dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they serve to fully understand what a police officer goes through in a confrontation that they may only face once or in their career, or in my case, a few times, but never actually having to pull the trigger. But it is, in any event, a highly emotional, very dynamic situation that lasts a mere few seconds. And trying to judge whether the officer did things appropriately or not is difficult to do when you have no other evidence to look at. So my position is body cameras or the video they create is one facet of a review. I don't want you to get the impression that what I'm about to tell you is what I foresee as the sole solution to a problem. So what is a body camera? Can you see this? And I'm going to do what I did at the Rotary meeting. I'm going to pass this device around. You'll notice that the battery pack that goes with it is not attached. I don't want you inadvertently turning it on, because when I take this back to my department, it has to be set in the machine to be recharged, and it will send any recording that's made on here up to the cloud, and where it'll be forever stored. So I'm going to just pass the actual camera around so you get an idea of what it looks like, what the size is. This is the whole device. This is just the battery and the on-off switch. It's this little round button in front.
Does it communicate wirelessly into the...
No, this one actually has a wire, but I didn't bring it. I brought it to the Rotary Club, and I found out when I got it back, some people decided to see how it worked and tried to take it apart. So I don't want to go through that again. So I'll start over here. They're curious. So why am I even talking to you about this? Well, it's because the Bellingham Police Department in January of last year decided that we would pilot a program to test those cameras to see how they work. And we got the Taser company to loan us 6. Right away we were down to 5. One of them malfunctioned. New technology is not always reliable. And we put them in the field where our officers wore them for 90 days, and we looked at the videos to see what they captured and what the quality of the video was like. So to evaluate whether this is a tool we wanted to purchase. And frankly, there was some hesitancy within the department. The officers are a little worried about when do I turn it on, when do I turn it off? All those kind of questions about how do I operate it, when is it appropriate not to use it. And through that process, we developed a policy, and we decided to go ahead and implement. So we purchased 40 camera systems, and we implemented a program in September. Not every officer is wearing one. This is a voluntary program right now. And quite frankly, I couldn't put one on every officer in the department because I don't have a sufficient number. That little device, when you use it, will only record up to 6 hours of video. And when you're done, it takes literally the same amount of time to upload what's on it that it took to record. It's minute per minute. So you may have 6 hours of recording on there. You have to put it in the charger. It's going to take 6 hours for it to upload. So it's not something I can say, stick it in that charger for an hour and then take it out and go back and use it. It has to sit in there for several hours. So there's a rotation aspect to this technology. Part of our decision to utilize this equipment was to provide a means to do two things. To demonstrate the level of accountability that we hold our officers to, and reassure this community that the officers of the Bellingham Police Department are policing in the way this community wants us to police. And secondly, quite frankly, to protect my officers from unwarranted complaints. Because when you're dealing with some citizens one-on-one out in the field, and you're having to take some enforcement action, you upset people, and invariably someone decides they're going to make a complaint. And we spend lots of staff hours investigating a complaint that is, at the end, it turns out to be that it wasn't even a valid complaint. It was just a means of harassing an officer. So we've done that. And the program has been working fairly well. Within that first 3 months, we recorded over 200 videos, a little over 40 hours of videotape, if you want to refer to it as tape. That's not the correct term. And since that time, as of last month, we had over 400 videos. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, 400 videos, approximately 300 hours total. Now, some of these are as short as less than a minute, and some of them are 20 or 40 minutes. So we make these tapes, and I think the question you're going to ask is, what do you do with them, Chief? Well, they go to the cloud when they're uploaded, and unless we identify a video as being needed for a specific purpose, prosecution of a criminal case, evidence, we've received a complaint and it's evidence of that complaint, or we see a viable training purpose to that video, we'll hold it. But all other videos come off the system and are actually destroyed after 90 days by this cloud-based record system. It is, for your information, owned by Taser Company. It is called evidence.com, and if you do any research with some of the major agencies that are using this system, you'll find that pretty much they're all using it. Frankly, it was our only choice, because if we tried to do it in-house, we couldn't afford it. So for 42 cameras and the service for storage of those videos for a 3-year period, we spent $180,000. Now, there's going to be an ongoing cost to this system when that contract expires, but I think it's a good investment for us. However, we're going to need to buy some more, and that's problematic because we don't have the money. So I've given you kind of an idea, a very general idea of what the department's doing with them. The question is, what are the risks? And there are some. There are privacy issues that I'm concerned about, and many of the officers in the department are worried about. In fact, so much so that through the State Sheriffs and Chiefs Association, we have submitted a bill that would change how these videos are viewed in the realm of public records. Now, when the state's public record law was originally written, it was written at a time period when the vast majority of government records were in paper form. Well, that's changed. And it's one thing to read a police report about what an officer saw and did at, say, a domestic violence call, than there is to literally have a videotape of that domestic violence call while the officers are present. Another example that I would give you is it's one thing to read a report that describes how a victim describes an attack. Let's use, for instance, a sexual assault to that officer, and that's placed in a police report for purposes of documentation and later for purposes of prosecution if the offender is apprehended. It's a whole nother matter, in my opinion, when that victim's statement is taken through video and audio at the time that they're interviewed at the hospital. And what I'm trying to say is that many times our officers may be videoing victims in particular, or citizens who are otherwise probably in the worst situation they will ever experience in their entire life. Take, for instance, a family dispute, a domestic violence call where that is taped. And we may even have made an arrest. And that tape's going to be used as evidence for prosecution of that arrest. It has a lawful purpose. But my opinion is that is its sole purpose. And one of the problems we have with the current public records law is that anyone in this room could make a public records request for that videotape, and we would have to provide it to you. Now that doesn't sound like a bad thing, does it?
Does to me.
It's even worse when the requester's intent is to take that video and upload it to YouTube, where it's now available for anyone in the world to see. And it's there as long as that person wants to leave it posted there. So for us, for the police department, our concern is we're creating things that we believe have a legitimate lawful purpose when it comes to criminal justice issues, but we do not want to create a medium that is used for the exploitation, whether it be for commercial purposes or merely to satisfy individual people's desire to be voyeurs. So currently, the State Police Chiefs and Sheriffs Association bill that's going through the House, and we should know by 5 o'clock today if it survives, will restrict who can ask for those videos. And in a very limited amount of time, I'll give you just a brief description. And that statute would say, if you are the subject of that video, if you are in it, you have a right to it. If you are a media outlet and you want that video, you first of all have to specify the date, time, and place and why you want it. And unless it's an exempted video, say in our case we would want victim interviews exempted, it may not be a tape we could release to you. And if you are just the average citizen that has this curiosity about what happened in my neighbor's house 3 days ago when the police were here, you're going to have to provide us with a court order where you have justified to a judge that you have a legitimate reason to have that video. Otherwise, we don't release it. Now that's what the bill is requesting the law be changed to. It's not final, it hasn't passed the Senate, it's just coming out of the House. My hope is that it passes. Because if it doesn't, my department will have to take a serious step back and say, is this something we want to continue doing? Many agencies across the state of Washington, because of this problem I just described to you, have not stepped into the realm of using body cams. Some agencies that have bought them haven't started their program because they don't want to get in that quagmire of public records requests. There are a handful of us, such as the Bellingham Police Department and 3 or 4 others, who have stayed the course with their programs to provide an example to legislators that this is something that is viable to law enforcement and the community. But if no changes occur to the public record statute, we're going to have to seriously consider whether we continue on or not. So I gave you a very general presentation about body cams. What I'd like to do is answer any questions you might have as best I can. But this is going to be, I think, something you're going to see happen across the country. Some states that do not have two-party consent, and I don't know if you're aware of what I'm talking about, but in this state, before I can record a conversation between you and I have to have both parties agree to it. In some states, you only need one-party consent. And that's usually the law enforcement officer who says, it's okay with me, so, yes, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Stand up and ask your question, sir.
Thank you, Greg Brown. When you did your introduction, you said this was just a piece of it. What do you think are the real pieces that'll put it together?
Well, I think a couple of things, critical things need to happen. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about how police shootings are reviewed and who makes the decision on whether they are justifiable or not. And the two primary methods are either through a grand jury system or through the prosecuting attorney's office. And in Ferguson, you probably recall there was a lot of criticism about the fact that the prosecuting attorney, was the one making that decision. And people said, well, that should have been someone else because they're too close to the police department. Well, I can't say that that's not an inaccurate statement to make in their case. I can tell you in this county, in spite of the fact that we work well with Dave McEachran's office, there is no way that I would suspect Dave McEachran would ever ignore wrongdoing by a police officer. But that's something I think this community has to be comfortable with. The other thing is trying to find the way, from my perspective, of educating the average citizen of what police work is really like. Because what you see on television, what you've seen, one of my worst, I hate to say this, one of my worst experiences was when I was a police lieutenant and later a captain in Fort Worth, Texas. We were one of the major cities that cops came to. You remember that show? And frankly, to me, that was an embarrassing show. They spent hours and hours riding around with my officers and other command level officers' staff to get a 30-minute show. So there were things that they were putting on that show that to the average citizen looked like, well, this is what police officers do in that city all day long. And it's not true. Quite frankly, police work is a lot of hours of very boring, routine activity with some really harrowing, intense moments interspersed in there depending on what the call is. So most citizens don't have an understanding of what that really intense situation is like, and they don't understand the decision-making process that an officer has to go through when they're faced with a situation where deadly force is an option. Yes, sir.
I just hope you always keep in mind that officer survival is paramount. And I worry about these cameras, and I'm seeing this all over the country. I'm still getting all the police publications that you're going to load that officer up with so much stuff that by the time he makes the decision, he's dead. Mm-hmm. I hope you're aware of that.
I am. Yeah, Jack.
Chief Cook, thanks for your talk. One of the interesting comments that you made that after 90 days of being in the cloud, that as I'm paraphrasing and changing it around, but you willfully destroyed public documents.
The system
Yes.
does, yeah. And
Under the public records law, we have an obligation to keep them.
That's only if the server's in your basement.
There you go. I'm wondering, in the bill that's coming forward, is that dealt with? Because, a civil rights claim has like a year. So you stop somebody for a traffic violation, there doesn't seem to be anything going on. 6 months later, they claim that the officer violated their civil rights, and you're gonna say, well, golly, I willfully destroyed the document that the proof of that. And you know how it goes. Washington County gets the same lawsuits. So is that addressed somewhere? And is that a concern of the police association?
it is a concern. It's not directly addressed in this current bill. The intent is that we need further discussion around those issues because there are much like automated license plate readers and those types of devices, the standard is not to hold them beyond 90 days not for the reasons of whether there's a pending civil litigation, but because of the concern that law enforcement could go back and use them for some other purpose beyond what we reasonably see as a time period is. If we're going to be advised that there's a crime, for instance, on, let's say there's a camera, a pole camera situated somewhere in the city, and it were recording, which is not happening currently, but let's just use that as an example. There are those systems available to law enforcement. The idea is to capture any criminal activity and then be able to go back and retrieve it to use it for investigative purposes. But then again, you also have innocent people who are doing nothing but going about their normal business who are captured in that video, and the idea is that it should be destroyed if it has no viable governmental purpose. I agree with you, there's a conflict with the intent behind governmental documents, but we're trying to remain consistent with what's currently the standard, and that's the standard. Like 911 tapes at our 911 call center are held for 90 days, unless there's a request or there's a specific incident that we need to retain them for. So I agree with you, there needs to be some further discussion, but quite frankly, I don't think anyone in the association wanted to bog the bill down beyond what we're currently trying to do, and frankly, it's been very difficult because the ACLU's position on body cameras is, yes, police officers should wear them. Everything that officers does should be recorded from the moment they start their shift to the end of their shift. That includes restroom breaks, going to lunch, having an innocent conversation with a citizen on the street, you know, just hi, how are you, you know, nice to see you. And their other caveat was the only thing the videos could be used for was accountability for law enforcement. So I was at that Senate hearing, or not the Senate hearing, but the legislative hearing, where they presented their version of, or their view in opposition to our bill. And one of the legislators on the committee was, thankfully was sharp enough to understand what that meant and said, so let me ask you a question. So we have a police officer wearing a body cam, and he's approached by an individual who, through the course of that interaction, pulls a weapon, shoots and murders the police officer and leaves. And the only witness is the dead cop in the video. And what you're saying is they couldn't use it to identify, capture, and prosecute the person that killed that officer. And the response was, our position is it should only be used for accountability for law enforcement. So I think you see how extreme some of the viewpoints are. I agree, there should be accountability for law enforcement. My department, and in my view, we are willing to accept that level of accountability by implementing these types of devices. But at the same time, I also want to benefit from the opposite side of that equation. So, yes, sir.
Mark Nelson, the fear I have has not been addressed either in paper or the news media that I've read, or the police officers I've interviewed on this too. The fear I have is a witness or a victim being interviewed, and the first contact in usually those situations is a street cop. I mean, usually they park detective, park street cop, and they serve in both roles. And so any police officer can go out as a detective and take a report in uniform. They'll be wearing that camera more than likely, and will inform the individual that maybe they're on camera. I assume that's the case.
That's our policy.
And it doesn't have to be, however.
No, we don't have to, but our policy requires the officer to say so.
That's what I want the public to know, is that you don't have to inform anybody, but your policy needs to do so. Now, this victim of an assault, rape, or whatever, call it, testifies to that police officer as to the events of that occurrence. Police officer has it on video. My fear is that the defense prosecution, the defendant is going to have an attorney, rhyming with unscrupulous, who is going to ask for that, is going to ask for that video. You will be obligated to turn it over as evidence, as a police chief and as a
Through
police
discovery,
department.
yes.
Yes, through discovery, by definition.
Right.
So you now turned over the victim's testimony, the witness's testimony that the police officer in due diligence got on camera. You turn it over to the defense attorney who plays it for the perpetrators who retaliate like hell against everybody.
Yeah, I think the only difference between the scenario you just described and what we're currently experiencing without the videos is the lack of the video. Because that scenario
Well, yeah,
happens
I do.
even
Yeah.
without video.
I don't quite know.
The things that we've done with our policy in regards to this use is, one, the officer has the discretion of when it's turned on and off, except when they're taking enforcement action. Any kind of enforcement action, whether it be a ticket, a physical arrest, we want those on tape. We've also, in our policy, require when the officer is going to interview a victim, that they advise them that they are recording in video and audio, unless the victim does not want us to. And if the victim agrees, we also ask the question, do you want this video to remain confidential, meaning it's used internally only. Now, there can be challenges to that, obviously through discovery. What we don't want to have happen is outside the discovery process is what's happened prior to video, or at least these types of videos, is where an individual convicted of, let's say, a sex crime is incarcerated in the state penitentiary, and through the process of wanting to appeal, allegedly, wanting to appeal their conviction, they contact the jurisdiction that did the investigation and say, I want all records pertaining to my case to include photographs of all my victims. And what happened, this is actually what happened in this state, the individual did that because merely they weren't interested in appeal, but for the offender sitting in a jail cell in a state penitentiary, the ability to look at those pictures of their victims again, and technically in their own mind they're re-victimizing that victim. That's what it's all about. So the state, after several years, under the current statute, decided to change that, where if you're incarcerated in prison, you don't automatically have a right to ask for public records just simply because you want them, to avoid that. So I think that'll happen with these kind of devices eventually. This is new technology, and like any other new technology, we're going to hit a lot of bumps in the road. But I think the critical point that was mentioned earlier by the gentleman who's retired out of LAPD is how hard or difficult is it for the officer to be thinking about this. And I will ask you, how long were you an officer? When did you start?
70.
Okay, you were about 5 years ahead of me.
They gave us a gun and a shotgun. We didn't have anything else.
So you didn't have a handheld radio.
No.
You didn't have a radio with a mic or anything like that. You didn't have, you probably didn't even have mace. Maybe
Nope.
you did.
No.
You might have had a baton,
Yep.
but not the expandable type.
No.
You didn't have a pistol. You were carrying a revolver with some extra loot.
Right.
If you're as tenured as I think you are, you were like me. You had loops with cartridges in it. You didn't even have a speed loader. And over the years in my
They
career,
were called
when they-
strips, speed strips.
speed strips. Well, that was even a little bit more technologically advanced from the loops. What I'm trying to say is, when the first time they handed me a handheld radio, it was like, it was always on my mind. Gosh, I got to remember to turn it on, you know, because it's of no value to me in the field. And then they gave us the ones that had the alert system on it, where if I had it on and I pushed a button when I was in trouble, it would send a signal back to the dispatch center, and they knew this is a cop in trouble, but he can't answer the radio. And one thing after another, and you're right, this is another device that they got to think about turning on. What surprises me, especially with the younger officers, is it's no big deal. Because they're already carrying around a smartphone doing a lot more things than I can do. They're operating computers in their car, multi-channel radios, all kinds of other, yeah, it's a concern. And to your point earlier, my overriding concern is that my officers go home every night. But the fact of the matter is, as long as things like this come along, we can either take advantage of them on our own terms, or we can have someone like the ACLU dictate the terms to us. And that's what I want to do. Yes, sir.
Randy Elmore, I don't know if the Bellingham Police Department has a guild or a union, but
It's a guild.
how does the guild feel about it?
They like the devices. There are still some officers that are hesitant. They have concerns about the privacy issues. They first brought those concerns to us because they don't want to be the person that, creates that video that causes a citizen embarrassment. They also recognize that we're at a disadvantage when we're in the field and something happens and 30 other people standing around watching all that going on is holding up one of these and recording it. And then later taking it home and editing it and only showing what they want to show and saying, look what this cop did to this poor person, when the reality is you missed the first 10 minutes of what actually happened. And so I think we've got to defend ourselves, obviously, but we also have to do it in a way that's professional and is responsible, and we can answer to the community how we're using the technology. So, yes, ma'am.
You said it was voluntary on the part of the officers.
Currently, yeah.
Ellen Baker, I have two really quick questions. Are there cameras in cars?
No, we don't have those, and I'll tell you, I don't know the history of this. I've been here a couple of years. I can tell you from my own other departments, the history has been either you were mandated to have them because of racial profiling laws in the state. In the state of Texas, if you didn't want to report national racial profiling statistics, you had to have a dash cam in every patrol car. Now, here's the difference. A current technology dash cam, HD, about $8,000 to $9,000 for the system. This is with the contract for storage, about $1,200. So this can be worn. It goes with the officer wherever they go. Dash cam sits in the car, and once the officer leaves the view of the car, that's all you're getting. So.
The other quick question was, I've heard that there are groups that would like to see all public officials, including fire departments, do the same thing, that they want to see, they want that to actually expand into fire service.
I haven't heard that yet. I know the problem would be the fire service is going into an environment that these would probably literally melt.
They wanted to record it in case they could
Yeah,
sue.
I know some of them have equipment where they can recording. It's mainly to, for investigative purposes or specific firefighting purposes, but I don't know them going to body cameras. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question, Joe Wilson, another device, a new device that some law enforcement are using is the stingrays. Do you have those, and what's
No,
your
sir.
position about that?
No, sir, I'm not interested in that.
Okay, very good.
Yes, sir.
Mark, you said the officer has the discretion to turn it on and off, whenever he wants. Officer to officer to officer, they might have different, one officer would turn it on in a situation, the other officer wouldn't turn it on in the same situation. So would the guidelines be set by the department?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, any enforcement activity this has to be on. We wanted the officer to have the discretion when they're just interacting with a citizen. It's not an investigation, it's not even a call. A lot of our officers have the opportunity to interact with residents just as they go about their business. And we didn't want citizens to believe that every interaction was being video recorded, because sometimes citizens want to give us information and they don't want people to know that they gave us that information. Other times it's merely just a casual conversation, and quite frankly, they're good for us. That relationship building has to occur, and I think what would be a non-stressful situation. I don't see you feeling comfortable coming up and talking to me knowing that every time you talk to me I'm going to record what you have to say. So we didn't want that other standard. We wanted it to be discretionary. One of the problems with this is if you watch these, especially if the officer wears it attached to their eyeglasses, and this will give you an idea, that gentleman can understand how cops are constantly always looking around at what's going on. They might even be talking directly to you, but they're actually looking over here. It's the sense of knowing what's going on around them. Try to watch that video. How many of you get car sick? You're bound. It's this amazing amount of movement. So some of the officers have actually gone to wearing them here on their lapel. which I'm worried about because sometimes you turn your head and what you see over here, that camera's not picking up. But I also believe there's going to come a day soon where every officer's wearing one, and the distinct advantage is that an incident when it occurs is going to have 3, 4, 5, 6 different views of what occurred. And it's already been proven in jurisdictions that have implemented the cameras where a questionable interaction occurred. There was, I know one in particular where if you looked at the one video, it looked like the officer just pulled his gun and shot this innocent person who was standing there doing nothing. And then when you look at the other officer's video, you actually see the individual that shot was holding a weapon down by their leg, but from that view it couldn't be seen. And then another officer's view camera showed that individual's arm coming up pointing towards the officer that actually shot him. I think inevitably we're going to have multiple views because multiple officers are going to be wearing them, and it gives us a better advantage to demonstrate and also educate the community about what the work is like. Yes, sir.
What would you guess your percentage of officers in the field are wearing these?
About half. Yes.
Elliot Fine, several questions. Have you heard of GoPro?
Yes.
Tied to this one particular company, $180,000 for 3 years for 40 cameras. What is that expected to go to, and also the cost of that? And then where are you getting the money? You're just going to write more tickets.
Well, here's an interesting thing about that. About half, if you're stopped in the city of Bellingham, your chances of getting a ticket are about 50%. That's the rate of issuance. We only write about half the people we stop. So I'd have to tell them they've got to quit doing that.
No, that's good public relations.
Right, exactly. And sometimes education is a better thing than being punitive. Yes, GoPro was one system. When we made this decision, there was only one alternative. It was a company out of Seattle who did not offer cloud storage. And when you put a pencil to what it costs for servers, someone to maintain those servers, and then when you need to go back and create an audit trail of where all those videos are and what they consist of, you got to have somebody do that. And it was far, far cheaper to contract with Taser because they have the system already set up. And it's strictly a law enforcement system. So they can't even look at my officer's tapes. Only we are authorized. And the one thing I forgot to tell you is the officer can't do anything to what's on this. All they can do is look at it after it's uploaded. They cannot change it, they cannot edit it, they can do nothing to it. There are only 3 people in the agency authorized to do any editing, and that's for records purposes. So if we get a request for a video and there's a child in that video, we want to be able to go in and redact that child's face. So somebody has to do that work. But it's like any other new technology. As things go by, we're going to run into more challenges, but I think eventually we're going to resolve them and we'll get the system working the way we would like it to. So, yes, sir.
Any experience with drones so far?
No, and frankly, I'm a little worried about it. I mean, you see stuff every day about, currently the state chiefs and sheriffs agreed with the governor last session that we would not push a drone bill. At least for 18 months, so it won't happen until next year if we do. Frankly, it's not something I would ordinarily see my department using, but I see uses for them. I'm more fearful about the numbers that are out there in private hands because there's no control there. And then when we have large, I worked in a very large department with large venue events, 200,000 and 300,000 people, and the thought of somebody being able to fly a little device over a stadium or something like that with explosives on it just frightens the heck out of me. Do I think there are legitimate purposes for drones? Absolutely. In Fort Worth, as a deputy chief, I was responsible for the air services unit. I had 2 Bell Jet Ranger helicopters, 2 flight crews, and a hangar, and a mechanic, and the maintenance that went along with that. It was a highly, highly expensive thing to operate. They were great when we needed them. They were wonderful when we needed to cover an area searching for a missing person, but they're expensive to operate. Whereas a drone, you know, a couple $1,000 and train somebody to use one and put them up, and if they're looking for somebody on a hilly area, it's a little easier to cover. Here's how ridiculous that whole discussion's gotten, though. Think of the Park Service, National Park Service, and if they want to do surveys from the air, which they currently do with aircraft, to determine the conditions of a forested area for fire and other things, how much cheaper is it to do it with a drone? But currently, the ways some proponents or people who are opposed to drones, they don't want that to happen. And to me, it's kind of counterproductive. I think as taxpayers, we don't want to see the government do something as efficiently, as cost-effectively as they can, but yet we also have concerns about whether they'll fly a drone. Yeah, but it's over federal property. It's owned by all of us. Why shouldn't they be able to do that? That's the concern I have, is that we're so overly concerned about abuse, and I'm not saying we shouldn't deal with abuse, but the fact of the matter is we're not taking advantage of some technologies that could save us thousands and millions of dollars, in my belief.
Dan Robbins, what percentage, guesstimate, do the police departments across the country have cameras? And is TASER making most of them?
I was invited to participate in a panel in Washington, D.C. a little over a week ago to discuss the program we had. The federal government's trying to come up with some guidelines, recommendations that agencies that are considering body cams can go to, and how you develop a policy, what you got to consider cost-wise. And there are about 3,000 police departments currently using body cameras, in one way or another. Keep in mind, there's over 17,000 police agencies in the country. Some of those may only have one camera, some may have all their officers. I know I met a chief from the state I was born in Michigan. He's the chief of a small agency in Marquette, outside of Marquette, if you know where that's at. It's in the Upper Peninsula. The snow's 8 feet deep. And he has 5 officers, and all 5 of his are using them. And they won't go in the field without them, he said. So it's a small percentage, but I think it'll grow. I think a lot of the issues around public records will have to be resolved.
A really important thing that came out before that I wanted you to talk about is, where do you have a constitutional right to privacy? And how does that interact with the system?
Let me finish answering your question. I'll get to that. Yes, TASER is the largest company. There's a company out of Seattle I mentioned earlier. There's 2 or 3 others that are newer corporations that are making body cams. Quite frankly, TASER was the one that met our needs and had the storage capability. That's the big thing. So when you are in a public place, let's say, for example, you're downtown walking around and you're in a public place and you're contacted by a uniformed police officer, that is an area in which an officer has the right or legal authority to video and audio record your conversation. Now, you as a citizen can say, I don't like the idea that you're recording me and I don't want to participate in this conversation. Where the officer, there are questions about whether they should or can, is, for instance, as I mentioned at the very outset of the presentation, was your home. Ordinarily, if we were to cross the threshold into your house and we were not there because of an active, ongoing criminal incident, for instance, you're not standing on the porch with your spouse beating on each other, we were called there for some other reason, then what our officers have to do is say, I'm audio video recording this contact unless you don't want me to. And in that environment, you as a citizen have the right to say, absolutely, I don't want you to, and we will turn it off. One caveat. If we were to go to your house, same scenario, we were called there for unknown circumstances, and we arrive and we hear what we recognize as an assault going on, and we step into the threshold of that residence and we see that assault, we have a legitimate right to record, because a crime is being committed. Now, how the courts are going to deal with it once we're in the legal process is a whole other issue, because some attorneys will make motions to have that video eliminated or couldn't be used. But that's what the whole legal process is about. So, yes, ma'am.
I have heard that the public behaves better if they know they're being videoed. Is that the experience of police officers? That we behave
Yes.
better?
Especially when they know it. The Rialto, California Police Department is one of the few agencies in the country that did a study of the impacts of body cams on interactions between police officers and citizens. We're part of a non-scientific study being done by the University of Washington right now. But out of the Rialto study, it was shown that citizen behavior improves, police officer behavior improves, complaints on officers go down, assaults on officers go down, and the uses of force go down. So there's a huge benefit. Now, this was posed to us at that panel discussion in Washington. Like all human beings, once something's been around long enough, we get accustomed to it, we kind of forget that it's there. So we're all on our best behavior right now. What happens after these things have been in place 5, 6 years, and it's just such a common occurrence? What's the likelihood of people just reverting back to the way they did things that really didn't care? And I think a lot of that's going to depend on the courts. If we as a society see videos having the kind of impact on holding people accountable as we would like, then I think the impact and effect will always be in place. The moment we don't see that anymore, I think you know the rest of that story.
Last question. Let's give it at least an opportunity to somebody that hasn't asked a question.
Yes.
Okay. I consider what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, an attempted lynching of a police officer. How do your officers feel about what's been going on? Do you have a sense from them?
Yeah, appreciate you asking, because I asked some of my staff that very question yesterday. We were very concerned at the level and nature of the reaction coming out of Ferguson before the investigation was complete.
By federal government officials.
Exactly.
Well, I didn't want to go there, Gary.
Bothers the hell out of me.
I've been in law enforcement 39 years now. I've seen any number of changes in policing as a result of different incidents, Rodney King's beating, other things. And I don't recall ever hearing the U.S. Attorney General come out with conclusions before an investigation was complete. And I was pretty dissatisfied with that, I guess the best way to put it. I mean, I respect the gentleman's office, but I think he jumped. I agree, there are issues with the Ferguson Police Department, obviously, from that report. I was also somewhat relieved, but at the same time, it troubled me how Officer Wilson was portrayed, that there was, again, it was a public decision. It wasn't a processed legal decision initially. And frankly, there were 3 victims in that whole scenario. There was a young man that was shot. And no matter what the cause was, taking a life is never something we want to do. There was the community, and nationally as well, the impacts. And then there was Officer Wilson, whose career is over, who I think probably, had we looked at things a little more slowly, been willing to consider, give things more time, the outcomes would be slightly different, for him at least. So for my officers, it's a concern, it's been a concern. There have been groups that have come into our community who want to generalize all the issues that I talked about earlier, police shootings all across the country, the deaths of individuals in their interactions with law enforcement. And a country that's not willing to look at its police officers and be critical and review what they do is not a country that we want to live in. At the same time, I think we have to recognize there is a legitimate legal process for that to occur in, and it shouldn't be in the realm of public opinion alone. So,
Outstanding program. Chief, thank you very much. We appreciate you and we appreciate what you do for us.